talk about landscape design today. So moving on to landscape design, first and foremost, I hate to tell you, but it's all based on your personal taste, personal preferences, and the growing environment. So unfortunately, I do not have a rubric that I can be like, this is going to be the best plant for your taste and your growing environment. Remember, in landscape design, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's just different. And so the main thing is it all depends on your personal preferences. But for starters, we need to ask ourselves what? We need to ask ourselves, what do we have? What do you like? What do you need? And what do you want? So that first question that we have to answer ourselves is, what do you have? You need to assess the value of the landscape that you currently have. You need to take into consideration what's your original investment. And we're not talking just monetarily investments. We're talking about time investments. We are talking about, how much time are you taking in the landscape? We need to take into consideration all aspects of the landscape with that. Now, what's the current condition? Is there some issues? Is there some dieback in the landscape? Is something overgrown and no longer serving its purpose? Like, what is something that you have in the landscape and what is its current condition? And then what are the future contributions? I have a very small tree seed sapling in my yard. It's not doing much right now. But down the road, let's say 10, 15 years, that's where I'm going to start getting the shade from that plant in that location. So in the future, the contribution to the landscape is going to change tremendously based on how that landscape matures. Now, next, we need to take a look at what we have in terms of, is it a whole landscape? Does it make sense? Is it functional? These are all great questions that you need to think about while you're looking at your landscape. Am I able to get from point A to point B without dodging around all sorts of things? In my backyard, the original owners installed some burning bushes. They were not the dwarf burning bushes. And so they are overgrowing the location where they were put. So is it functional? Not really the way it was intended. So then we have to make some changes to that in what we have in the landscape. Next, we need to think about what we like. And this is a personal preference when it comes to what you like. Do you like to blend in? Do you want to stand out? Do you follow trends or are you more traditional? It all comes down to what is your style. Do you mind the Nebraska style landscape where we're going to install some plant material that might be not following a nice form or nice formal structure? Are we taking a look at very structured, very balanced? Are we looking at some different landscape styles? And knowing what your style is and what you like and what you lean to will determine what you're going to put into that landscape. So we need to know what we like. Now, this is one of those opportunities. Well, I will tell you to get online. Go check out Pinterest. Go check out different websites. Find the landscape designs that talk to you and match your style, and it will be easier then to plan your landscape based kind of on what you see. Now, a lot of those landscapes are not going to be for the Nebraska, for the zones that we have, or for your growing environment. But at least you can pick out from those photos different aspects of it that you like that we can translate into Nebraska landscaping. So finding out what you like is going to help you out long term to determine. And then we're going to take a look at what you need. What works? What doesn't work? Now, the main thing is we select plant material based on its function first. And after we figure out what that function is, whether it's shade, whether it is adding interest to a particular location, if we're going to add color, once we find out what that function is, then we're going to pick the form or the shape, the final choices for those plant materials after we pick the function. But first and foremost, we need to take that into consideration and into mind. I see a question in the Q&A about some recommendations for Nebraska style landscaping pages on Pinterest. I really don't have any of those. You're going to just have to search and find what speaks to you. But in terms of Nebraska style landscape, we're kind of informal with a little bit of the prairie plants, so not extremely formal when it comes to the Nebraska style landscape. So based on you need to base your need on your function, not on an object or a want. And so when we talk about that, oftentimes what we want is first and foremost. We want X, Y, or Z. We want a pond. Who doesn't like a pond? Anybody who's ever had to clean a pond doesn't want a pond. So when you think about what you want, we need to take into consideration not only the aesthetics of it, not only the management of it, but we need to take into consideration how much time, energy, and effort is going to go into maintaining it the way that we want it. So in a pond situation, in a, even if it's a pondless waterfall, we're still going to have to manage that pond. We're going to have to manage algae. We're going to have to manage pests. So take that into consideration when we think about what we want. And when we're talking about what we want, we need.
You've frozen on us, Elizabeth. Oh, there you're back. We lost you, but you're back.
I know. So we need, for some reason, my internet's unstable right here in the extension office. It's fine. So we need to make sure that we change our way of thinking from I want A to I want to. From I want A is very specific. We're not talking about the function. When we talk about I want to, then we're talking about the function of that plant in the landscape. So for example, I want a tree that looks good all year round, doesn't drop any limbs or leaves in my yard, doesn't require any additional water and pruning, easy to care for. We have made that a very specific ask on what we want out of that tree. And it really narrows down the scope of what we're going to be able to find when we say we want A. Now, if we change that way of thinking into I want to have a tree that will shade my backyard, create habitat, be a place for relaxation, then we're opening up what we can put in that landscape to meet those needs. And then we're able to select that plant material based on the growing environment. So we really open the door and we look at that function more when we change the way that we are thinking from I want to I want A. We want A to I want to. So I want to is that design intent. I want to enframe or enclose a space. I want to direct focus attention to or away from a particular location. I want to create scale. Do you want to feel cozy? Do you want enclosed space? Do you want to be able to see vistas outside the landscape? We want to guide traffic through that landscape. Some of us want to screen or even provide a backdrop. So I talked about those burning bush euonymus. They surround my deck. Previous owner hedged them to the same level as the railing. I let them grow. Why? I am screening my back deck so all of my neighbors around me can't see me sitting up on my deck. That's what they were intended when they were planted. But the homeowner prior to us didn't like that, so they hedged them. So we had that design intent to screen and provide that. We're going to modify that climate. Again, we're talking about, are we providing that shade tree over the back deck? Are we going to provide a shaded environment for maybe our shade garden? But when we're looking at this design intent, we also want to provide multiple seasons of interest. And that's going to provide a lot of interest throughout the year. It's going to create a more cohesive environment. And it's one of those that's going to be more aesthetically pleasing as we go throughout the year. If you talk to any horticulture person, one of the things that's kind of come to the front is those plant considerations. So we're going to talk about the growing environment, the growing requirements, landscape zones, and then we are going to talk about some of those seasons of interest. So the growing environment, first and foremost, is the most important while we're selecting that plant material. So when we're doing that design intent, we said we want something shaded. We need to know how much room we have to work with. We need to know what the sun is. Is it full sun? Is it part sun? What exactly are we looking at? What's the moisture like? Are we exposed to winds, northwest winter winds, southwest summer winds? What are our soils like? Do we have new construction grade soils? Do we have existing soils that have been in place a long time? And slopes, that can all play a role in the plant material that we select. So growing environment is going to be one of the key things when we're talking plant selection. So making sure we really understand the location that we have, the growing environment that we have, what kinds of issues we might have down the road. So those pests and pathogens are going to play a big role in that. If that plant material is properly placed and it's happy, it's not going to be as susceptible to some of those pests and pathogens. If, however, that plant material is stressed, it's going to possibly be more susceptible to those pests and pathogens. So that's why selecting the right plant material for that growing environment is going to be key to make sure that that plant is overall healthy and happy. And then we need to take a look at those management practices. If we're going to hedge something like is in the photo, we're going to have to routinely come out and make sure that it is trimmed, it is hedged. We're taking any of the little sprouts that come off. So that's going to take more management, more time to devote to if we're going to hedge something. So if you're going to have that curly Q evergreen near the front door, just realize you are going to have to devote more time to keeping that curly Q looking like a curly Q throughout the seasons. So management practices will play a big role in the plant material that you select, or maybe on the style of landscape that you have. So ideally, we want to create these landscape zones. And what's going to happen is we're going to put plants with similar requirements in the same locations. We're going to group them or mass them in mulch beds and keep them away from the turf. So if anybody has ever had, I've got a 12-year-old boy that runs a lawnmower. Love him to death. I don't trust him mowing around a plant in the middle of the yard. So creating these landscape zones is going to be key to not only help that plant thrive because it's not immediately surrounded by turf, but it also helps with the management and keeping those mowers away from them. Also keep in mind that especially with a lot of our plant material, the roots are going to extend well beyond the edge of the landscape. So a tree's roots are going to go out 2 to 3 times the height of the tree. So making sure that we take that into consideration, especially when we're talking those shallow rooted trees, that's going to make a big difference when it comes to how we're going to take care of that landscape. So, we're talking lindens have a shallow root system, cast heavy shade. It's going to be difficult to keep turf alive underneath that linden. So let's create a zone underneath that linden where it's a win-win. So we're not having to fight the root systems. We're not having to fight to keep turf alive, but we're still able to shade that area underneath the tree so we don't have those weeds pop up. So this wouldn't be a landscape design talk without at least touching on the landscape design elements and principles. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I feel like I can show you a lot better when we're talking about a lot of these principles and elements. So we have line, which line is either the line in the ground or the line that our eye follows. Form is going to be that shape. Do we have rounded shapes? Do we have pyramid shapes? Like, what is the form of that? Texture is one of those things where it's in relationship to what's around it. So things with big, bold leaves are going to look like a coarser texture than those items with a smaller, finer leaf. And that'll play a role in how it comes out in the landscape, because the coarser textures are going to come out at you, the finer textures are going to recede. Same goes for like color. Warmer colors are going to come out at you, cooler colors are going to recede. And so that will make a big difference when you're trying to select plant material for a specific location. Let's say we have a dark location, picking one of those brighter colors like white or yellow is going to help it to pop and come out in that dark spot. And then when we're talking about these principles, some of them like balance. Balance doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same plant material on both sides. Balance can mean that we have similar weighted plant material on both sides. So we might have 2 different shrubs, but the shrubs are going to be a similar shape or a similar weight in the landscape. Repetition, are we using that plant material again and again in the landscape to create a cohesive landscape? Our scale, that can make a big difference, not only our absolute scale, but also a scale related to a human. So if we're talking in a location where it's above 6 foot, you're going to feel very enclosed, as opposed to in a landscape where maybe it's 2 to 3 foot tall. So that proportion and that scale is going to give you a different feel when you're in that landscape. Rhythm and unity, is it cohesive? Does it go together in that landscape? And then the emphasis, also known as that focal point in the landscape. So I have some photos to kind of give you an idea on what some of those are that we're looking at in the landscape. So if we take a look at this landscape, we've got different textures. If we look at the plant material closer to us, it's got a bigger, bolder texture. It's got a leaf on it that is going to give you a little bit of a different appearance to it. This is much bigger, bolder textures as opposed to the grass, where it's very fine. So that grass texture is going to recede, where the big, bold textures come out. When we're talking about the line, there's a line in the turf that follows this around. Now that line does several things. That line is very distinct from the turf. It tells us where the bed edge is, but in this landscape, it also draws your eye around to the benches, to the pot, to the pergola. And so it does 2 things. It's a line in the ground, but it also draws your attention around to that location. So some of the other things in this one, we're using that repetition. We're using similar plant materials on one side as we do on the other side, similar plant material all the way around, similar colors. So there's lots of repetition out in this landscape. Now, sometimes we can have a landscape kind of go a little too far. So this is a photo. I agree. I love spring color. Okay. But the thing to keep in mind is if there's too much going on at once, your eye doesn't know where to go. So we've got daffodils, flowering quince, we have redbud, and we have forsythia and a flowering crab all in bloom at the same time. Now, what's going to happen in a couple weeks? All those flowers are going to fade, and then we're not going to have a lot of seasonal interest. We're not going to have a focal point once those flowers begin to fade. So that's where we're going to possibly try to select plant material that we're going to have interest throughout the year. Or maybe we're going to select plant material that has multiple seasons of interest. So that way, when we take a look at this landscape in summer, or we take a look at this landscape in fall, there's something of interest to take a look at that point in time. My mouse doesn't want to work. Sorry, everybody. So also when we're taking a look at that line, so line can be what draws our eye. And so in this one, we're using a vertical line. So we're putting a very vertical plant in front of a chimney that's also going to draw our attention up. So that does several different things there. It's going to help with that design framework, draw our eye up, and it's also going to draw our eye over to that pot. So that's going to do multiple things in that location. In this location, we took into consideration the growing environment. We're using odd numbers of plant material, which is going to be key. When we're using odd numbers of plant material, it helps to give us if we use odd numbers, that's more visually appealing, more aesthetically pleasing. Then our eyes don't kind of bounce back and forth if there's only two. If there's three of something, that creates more of a cohesive appearance. So we've got lots of different textures in this landscape. We have broad, bold textures of the hostas and the hydrangeas. We've got pachysandra down in front, which in this one looks like a finer texture to that. Yes, we will have some color. We'll have some color in the fall from the burning bush. We'll have some hydrangea color. The chartreuse of the hostas really comes out at you because it's a lighter green kind of a coloration to it. So we're using lots of the design elements in here, making sure that we're meeting the needs with that nice serene bench in that location. Also, we're going to talk about, the balance of the landscape. So by balance, we're talking about, do we have equal plant material on either side? Is it something that feels like the picture is going to tip over to the side? But we have a very distinct line in the turf through the walkway here that draws your eye around. Also, we've got a very distinct vertical line from the tree trunk in this location of the landscape. So we're not only providing some proportion or scale with some of these larger plant materials kind of back behind and flanking the little building in there. We're providing multiple seasons of interest in here. So there's lots of different principles that are going on in this landscape. So in this one, we can talk about several different things. We can talk about form. So when we talk about form, we're talking about shapes. And sometimes if we want to take a look at the shapes, we're just going to take a look. Okay, we have a rounded form, a rounded form, a rounded form, a rounded form. So we've got all these rounded forms in this landscape where it's all very circular. So that's something to keep in mind, is if we change the form, if we change the shape of that plant material, we can kind of have something stand out and be a focal point. Or maybe, you know, we talk about the line, what draws your attention? Well, we've got the focal point here that's a different color. So a focal point doesn't necessarily have to be something that's a different color. It could be another form, it could be another texture, but we will follow the line of the walk and it leads your eye right over to where it's different. If you want to get a good idea of what forms are, you can take a look at the landscape in the winter. Another way is you could just turn the picture black and white, or you could do both. Either one works. But that gives you a good idea on what the form is of these different aspects of the landscape. So we have a nice pyramid shaped form of our evergreen trees here. This one's got a little bit of funk to it because he's a little older, but that's fine. And then we've got also almost a pyramid shape to that flowering pear with some rounded forms in front. So, you know, by varying those forms up, varying deciduous and evergreens in the landscape, we can provide some different aspects. We've got the vertical line of the tree trunks in here, followed by the horizontal line on the ground, following the bed line in here. So we can see these distinct lines. And if the lines don't line up, or if they don't look quite right, you know it, but you don't know why you know it. So that's something to keep in mind, is when you're looking at your design, make sure that the lines make sense, make sure that they're meeting up so they're not causing issues down the road. This is this is a younger landscape, but they are using repetition in the landscape. So we're repeating the Russian sage on the sides and out front in front of the landscape. We're repeating the black-eyed Susans and having a similar color with the Stella de Oro daylilies. And we are providing a lot of fall interest around this water feature, because a lot of this plant material is going to be in bloom in the fall. So if we're talking at a school, that's a great opportunity, because the children are all there in the fall and in the early spring. So the time of year will play a big role. I help out at the Fauner Park, which is the home of the Nebraska State Fair. A lot of times we want to have our interest during that fair season. So that way, any of the fair goers that come will have the plant material at its peak. So this is a landscape that we are repeating those forms again. We've got repetition of the pyramid shape down here in the panicle hydrangeas, the paniculata hydrangeas. So, I mean, it's more of a subtle repetition, but it is something that we see in this landscape. Another one where we're talking about forms is we are taking a look at repetition in this one. We're looking at some of the mounded forms in these locations. We're looking at a repetition of color. We are repeating similar textures with the grasses, and then that texture of the grass is going to change. So we have the grass in front that is in flower. We have grasses in back. So, I mean, we have lots of different things going on in this landscape that are providing multiple seasons of interest. So when we're talking scale, this is one of those opportunities when we're talking about whether or not we're balanced. And in a very formal landscape, what's on one side is going to be what's on the other side. In this one, we've got, you know, those two big shrubs and a little shrub, two big shrubs and a little shrub. Now, it looks visually appealing to those people that like a very formal landscape. The downside to this style of landscape design is the fact that if this shrub dies, what do you do? Do you take out this shrub and then replace them both? Do you try to limp along and get a smaller shrub in this size and wait for it to get to that size? So I mean, when we're talking management of a very formal landscape, sometimes it provides a degree of difficulty that we don't consider. And so that's something to keep in mind if you like a very formal style. So this is one where we have more of an informal style. Informal style, every plant has its rhyme or reason of why it is in that location. Taller toward the back, shorter toward the front, multiple seasons of interest. But that's something to keep in mind is this is not what's on one side is what's on the other side, but every plant has their rhyme and reason of where they're located in there. So when we're talking that order design framework, if we're talking natural, it's turn your back, throw your hands up, wherever that plant lands is wherever it needs to go. And so that one can be a little bit more difficult. Not everybody can design with that framework in mind. It takes a very special person to do that, which is not me. But that's something that we need to consider is we've got the formal style, we've got an informal style, and then we have the natural style. And selecting the one that works best for you is going to help you out long term. Now, when we're talking scale, this is one of those opportunities where we not only need to talk about the scale of the plant material when it goes in, but we also want to consider the overall scale of the plant material when it reaches near maturity. So when we're talking 2/3 mature size or mature size. So think about this house with a tiny crabapple. Okay, now think about a 1-story ranch house with this giant oak. They really, one is going to dwarf the other. The scale is going to be off, but you're not sure how you're going to know until that plant reaches its mature size. So thinking about that long term, what's this going to add to my landscape? What's it going to provide? Because in this instance, this is a great opportunity for a large house to have a large tree out front, and they look like they should go together. It's not like one is dwarfing the other. So when we're talking about seasons of interest, this is one of those where we're going to emphasize one spot with color or a texture change. This experience is going to change throughout the season, and you can combine your woody and herbaceous plant materials together. So in this opportunity, we're going to use those hardscapes, those garden elements. We're going to look at it from all vantage points because we want to make sure that we are drawing attention to things we want to see, like our pergola in our backyard, our bench, our awesome shade tree, things along those lines. And it's not drawing our attention to our trash cans or to the dog kennel or to those other locations. So that's going to be key is we want to make sure that we're looking at it for all seasons and that we are screening or maybe drawing attention away from those unsightly things. Now, adding multiple seasons of interest can also mean leaving their seed heads. This is not Nebraska, but this is an opportunity to be like, okay, in this landscape, what's this going to look like down the road? It looks gorgeous right now in full bloom. What happens when those daffodils begin to fade? Then we're going to have other plant material that's probably going to come up in there to continue to grow, but we've got that shaded environment, we've got those tree leaves, but that's really going to change as that growing season continues. Also, what plant material you have in the landscape is going to also change as well. So, you know, we talk about the grasses, the pennisetums. They look much finer when they're early on. Then we get the seed heads on there that are going to add that interest. And then we've got those Rudbeckias down in front, the black-eyed Susan. Well, the black-eyed Susans look good in the summer, and then they're going to provide a little bit different texture, a little bit different color as the seasons progress. Then we let those seed heads really stand over the winter. It does multiple things. It's going to provide winter interest. If we mow that back in the fall, there's nothing in that bed that's going to provide some interest. So letting the plant material stand is going to be key in order to move forward. We also talk about those seasons of interest as well. So in the spring, we've got our red buds. They draw your attention. What happens as summer progresses? Those red buds are going to recede into that landscape because there's not that color difference. Those are some things to keep in mind with that, is it's going to change throughout the growing season. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the landscape not only during the spring season, during the summer season, but we need to take a look at the landscape during winter, during fall. What can we do in order to add interest to that landscape during those other times of the year where it might not be as easy to provide that winter interest? Now, all that being said, it's based on your personal tastes. There's no right or wrong. There's just different. And so now we've talked about that landscape design process. We're going to move a little bit more. We know our landscape design principles and elements. We know about the growing environment. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start that process. We are going to take a look at our usage. We are going to take a look at the recreation, the gardening, the entertaining, the hobbies. What are you going to do in that landscape? And what you're going to do in that landscape is going to determine what you're going to put in there. Now, we talked about that style. Knowing what style you like, what your management style is, how much time you have to devote, the preferences for the plant, and the budget will all play into this landscape design process. So with a budget, if we're not able to install it all in one shot, can we do it in phases where maybe we add a little bit at a time? If I prefer easy to grow, low maintenance plant material, that's going to make a difference in what I pick. I'm not going to put a topiary by my front door because that's going to be too much management for me. So knowing a little bit of background on what we talked about earlier is going to make this landscape design process easier in the long term. Now, take a look at your landscape. Is it a collection of plants and objects? Is it an experience? How do you feel, or how do you want to feel in your landscape? Those are all questions that you're going to need to answer before you move forward. So what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at the site. So we're going to designate family area, functional area. We're going to designate where the public area is. We are going to designate where the utility area is. Those are going to be key things that we need to keep in mind. So that public area, front door. It's what the public is going to see when they come up to your landscape first thing. I don't want to say curb appeal, but curb appeal. Most of the time, our private areas are going to be those that are going to be in the back. They're not things that we want to share with everyone. We want it to be our oasis. So, in that public area, what's out front? Do we have to worry about utilities out front? In the private area in the back, what are those activities that I'm going to do? I've got kids. I want lawn for them to run around on. That's going to be different than somebody who wants to change it into a vegetable garden or maybe install some pollinator plants. So knowing and analyzing that site and what activities you're going to do in those locations are going to be key. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to prepare that base map. That base map is what is in that location already. If you've got a blank slate, this is super easy. But if you have existing plant material, you need to take that into consideration in that base map. You need to know where the property lines are. You need to know where the electrical and water lines are. Where's the driveway? Where's the sidewalk? Which direction are the prevailing winds coming from? That's going to make a big difference. So for the most part, our winter winds are going to come from the north and west, and our summer winds are going to come up from the south and west. We need to make sure that we know if we want to maintain a line of vision outside of these doors and windows, or if we want to screen them. Do you want to be able to look out your living room window? If so, don't put a tree here because that will block your view to the street to see who's coming. So that's all going to make a big difference in your base map. Putting that existing plant material in there, putting what is there, what views you want to maintain. Those are all going to be a big aspect that you want to include. We also need to consider, like we talked about, the growing environment. What's the soil like? What's the light like? You know, if you tell me something's on the north side, I'm going to automatically do shade. If you tell me something's on the south side, I'm going to automatically think sun, unless you tell me there's a giant shade tree that casts shade over the entire landscape. So that all makes a big difference in that. What type of facade do you have on the house? If it's a brick facade, it's going to get super warm in the spring. It's going to hold heat. Sometimes that plant material out in front is going to break bud early. So we need to take that into consideration. How we approach and how we leave the landscape is going to be key. Do you approach and leave through your front door? If you don't, how easy is it to go through the side door? Do you go in and out through the back patio? How are you going to utilize this landscape? We talked about the views and the vistas through the windows. And then also, you might have a great relationship with your neighbors now, but what happens if that relationship either deteriorates or maybe you get new neighbors? There might be an opportunity that you might want to kind of screen your neighbors or kind of block them off. You also need to take into consideration constructed elements like walks and ponds and berms, lights, things along those lines. So, you know, you want to try to develop that bubble diagram. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you what the function is in that location at that particular time. We're not calling out plants right now. We are looking at, okay, I would like a shade tree in my front yard. We are not saying we want an elm or an oak or anything. We just want a shade tree. We want a shade tree over our back deck. We're going to put in a patio. We're going to put in a color garden under the Japanese maple. You know, wind screens, evergreen screens, visual screens. So this bubble diagram is big picture. We are not calling out plant material at this point in time. The next step is that preliminary design. This is when we're going to call out, I want a large tree, I want a small tree, I want a perennial, I want a ground cover. We're going to narrow it down from that bubble diagram, and we're going to be more specific with that preliminary design. The next step with that landscape plan is then calling out that plant material for what we're looking for and for that growing environment. Now, like I said, we're shooting for that 2/3 mature size. So we're going to select that plant material that's going to be hardy for our location, that's going to work well for that size. So when we talk about that, is this river birch going to be of this size when it immediately goes in? No, but eventually it's going to get to the point in time where it's going to shade over that deck. Same with the dogwood located here, or the boxwoods or the hollies. These are going to be things that are going to take time in order to reach that mature size. Now, are we going to be able to install all of this at once? That is up to your budget. If you are unable to, then we're going to break it down into manageable phases or, you know, chunks. What's one thing we can do? And so with those phases, oftentimes it's going to be that's going to have the most long-term benefit. So in this landscape, they wanted to put in a windbreak and they wanted to put in screens. Those are going to be some of the first things that you're going to want to do to get them up and established, because that's going to help you out long-term. Now, in this one, they put some yews. We're putting a plant in the front to shade the driveway. So these are all going to be a manageable phase. Do them in chunks. But once you have your area kind of picked out and your plant material narrowed down, that's going to help you out long-term down the road. So that's something that I can't do for you, but it's going to help you out once you get to that point in time. So, you know, yes, it's overwhelming when you first look at it, but start small. Take a small section, determine what you want to do there. And remember, we're going to change our mindset from I want from I want A to I want to. So we're not going to automatically say, hey, I want a river birch in my backyard. No, I want to shade my back deck, provide interest with the plant material that I select. Maybe I'm looking to create environment where we're going to invite wildlife, but we want to make sure we change it to I want to and not I want a, because oftentimes many of us are plant lovers and plant collectors. And so what is it that we do? We go to the nursery, we see a plant, we take it home, and then we try to make it fit into the landscape that we have. That's great if you have the growing environment for that plant and you've been planning on having that plant. If it's more of a spur of the moment, hey, I haven't seen this plant, I want to try to get it to grow in my landscape kind of thing, that's where we don't have success long term. That's where we don't have that cohesive feeling, and it's going to feel more of like a collection of objects or a collection of plant material instead of a whole landscape. So having a plan in place can help you from, buying plant material to that we need. So real quick, I'll finish up here. I'll show off my laser pointer first. Okay. So we have some different resources. We do have an EC. This is a longer publication that we have. Understanding the basics of landscape design. There is a cost associated with it, but you can get it from our marketplace. We have something called landscape sustainability. This is like a NEB guide that's available. And then also we have a resource on landscapes for shade. And again, this is going to be one of those landscapes that's going to give you some opportunities for plant material that's going to do well in the shade. I can put my contact information into the chat pod.